So as I said, I'm now at the University of Salford, which is really part of Manchester, although you wouldn't say that to Salfordians. But I began this work whilst at the University of Liverpool, so I've been working really on tick-borne disease for about the past 10 years or so. And a lot of my early work was on anaplasma infections in sheep, but more recently we've moved to Lyme disease in human beings. Okay, so just a bit of microbiology to start with. I'll try and keep the science as light as I can because it is a weekend. But the red squiggly things that you can see on this slide, these are bacteria. These are about a micron long, so you can get probably 3,000 on a pinhead or something like that. But these squiggly bacteria, this is Borrelia burgdorferi, which is the etiological agent, the cause of Lyme disease. And that's as far as the microbiology is going to go, I think. So just to really explain how Lyme disease, Borrelia burgdorferi, maintains itself in nature. So it's transmitted by ixoidid ticks, and in the UK we really focus in on Ixodes ricinus, which is the deer tick to this audience, but equally the sheep tick if I was talking to a room full of farmers. But it's a very Catholic feeding tick. It shows no real host specificity. It lives its life in the vegetation. I'm sure, again, I'm telling you stuff you already know. And it quests for a host, and essentially any vertebrate that happens to be in the vicinity and brush past the tick will grab hold of it and will use that host as a source of a blood meal. So ticks have multiple life stages. The female ticks lay eggs. These eggs hatch into larvae. Larvae then will find typically a small vertebrate host, a rodent, maybe a foraging bird or something like that. It will take a blood meal from the host. It will then fall off the host. It will molt over a period of several weeks to several months into the next life stage, which is the nymph. And the nymph again will find a new host, feed on that, go through the molting again, eventually emerges either an adult or male or female. These tend to congregate on deer. Deer are kind of almost like nightclubs for ticks, where the males and the females get together. The females will where they'll mate. And often when you see those big replete female ticks, particularly on a deer head, if you look under it, you'll see a male tucked underneath, having his evil way. But once the mating has happened, the female will blood feed to give herself the energy to lay the eggs and therefore complete the cycle. As far as Borrelia burgdorferi is concerned, there's a very little bit of transmission from females into eggs, but almost nothing at all as far as we know. So larvae tend to be sterile. They acquire infection when they take their first blood meal, but then the Borrelia is maintained through each of the stages of the tick. So once the larvae has fed on an infected host, it remains infectious for its first and its second blood meal. And that's really how we believe Borrelia is maintained naturally. Humans and probably our companion animals are dead-end hosts. As I said, the ticks are not fussy about what they feed on. If they encounter a human, they will feed on the human being, but we are not thought to be competent for Borrelia. In other words, we can't act as a reservoir for the bacterium, so we are considered, in an ecological sense, a dead-end host. We also develop a pathology. We develop Lyme disease, whereas we don't think in any of the reservoir hosts there's any obvious pathology associated with carrying the bacterium. Okay, so a bit of epidemiology. So these are the figures of laboratory confirmed cases from England and Wales and Scotland for Lyme disease really over the past 20 or so years. And actually the 2017 data have been released fairly recently for England and Wales, and you can see now, well, undoubtedly there's an upward trend since the turn of the millennium. So we've gone from having, a couple of hundred cases up to now about 1,500 confirmed cases, so laboratory confirmed cases in England and Wales. In Scotland, that figure is ticking along at about 200 cases a year. So the incidence in England and Wales and Scotland is kind of about the same. But undoubtedly, there's an upward trend, and the question is that I'm going to try and answer throughout this talk is why this is happening. What is driving this upward trend? And I'm going to break down this burden, this public health burden of Lyme borreliosis, of Lyme disease, into two possible risk areas. First, I'm going to talk to you about the environmental hazard. So this means how many infected ticks are there in a particular area? Is that number increasing? What evidence do we have for that increase? And if it's increasing, why is it increasing? Why are some areas more ticky or more infected ticky than other areas? So that's what we call the environmental hazard. And we also, when we think about the public health burden, is we have to consider the rate of human exposure. If we have lots of infected ticks on some remote island where no one ever goes, from a public health perspective, we don't care about it. If there are infected ticks in areas of which are highly popular with human beings, from a public health perspective, we really do care about it. So, the burden is really a product of these two factors, and I'll talk about them both. Okay, so the evidence suggests we don't have a whole load of empirical evidence for this, but we do have some evidence. So I'm thinking really about the environmental hazard here. So we do have some evidence that the numbers of ticks in the UK is on the rise. And perhaps the most comprehensive survey was done 10 years ago now by a group in Oxford, where they simply asked people, are there more ticks where you live now than 20 years ago? And if there were no ticks 20 years ago, are you seeing ticks now? And you can see that in general, or maybe you can't see, but the red triangles indicate an upward trend. So generally, the picture across the country was that the range was expanding, and where ticks had previously been seen, more ticks were being seen today. So not entirely quantitative, but nonetheless quite a clear indication that across the UK, tick numbers were increasing. So why might this be happening? Well, the obvious correlation is with deer abundance. We know, and again, I shouldn't be saying this to you guys because you know that the trend in deer abundance in the UK is rocketing up. And equally, I don't need to tell you that when you look closely at deer, they are very, very important hosts for ticks. So we've done some painstaking work counting ticks on deer, and this roe deer here, we had about 15,000 before we gave up. So huge. This was from Kielder Forest. This particular deer. But they can carry thousands and thousands and thousands of ticks, not just the big adult females that are obvious, but also the earlier life stages, the larvae and the nymphs as well, which are much harder to spot, particularly before they start to blood feed, so before they start to bloat up. So we know that deer are very, very important in terms of providing blood meals to ticks, and the deer population has been increasing. And we've been doing some work looking at how important deer are at moving ticks around the landscape. And this is a study we did on Bethica Moor, which is in southern Cumbria. Here's Coniston Water here, just to give you some bearings if you know that part of the world. And this is common land. So this is, I'm not sure how widely adopted common land is in Scotland, but in Cumbria, farms sharing a common moorland, given rights, access rights have been associated with the farms for centuries, is a very common phenomenon. So this moorland here, which is about 5 kilometres by 3 kilometres, is shared by about 4 or 5 farms. So the farmers were telling us, for example, that there were bad parts of the moor and good parts of the moor in terms of ticks, that they might keep their sheep away from certain parts of the moor because of the risk of ticks. And we kind of half believed the farmers, but we wanted to try and empirically test if what they were saying to us was correct. So we generated random points across the moor, and we went out over a number of days dragging for ticks. So we just drag a blanket across the ground over a set distance, and then we turn it over and we pick the ticks off, and we record that, and we check where we are with the GPS. And so we surveyed on about 400 points across the moorland, and then we pump the tick abundance data and create a kind of risk map. And this is the risk map that we created, and we saw that the distribution of ticks across the moorland wasn't uniform. There were far more ticks to the north and to the east. Is that the east of the moorland? And this wasn't all that surprising. There's plenty of data out there showing that areas proximal to forest here tend to be more ticky. So we did some modelling of this, and this kind of backed up the idea that proximity to woodland was important, but we were also interested, as I said a couple of minutes ago, is the impact of deer here. So we were able to map the deer presence on the moorland primarily by just sitting and watching and asking rangers and farmers where they tended to see deer, and as I said, doing surveys ourselves. And we did see a reasonably good correlation between where the ticks were and this deer corridor that runs from coverts down here into this big patch of forest up here. So we do have some evidence, at least on a local scale, deer are very important at moving ticks around, introducing ticks onto pasture. And it's interesting what you were saying about the interaction with sheep, that ticks and disease may be relevant to that conversation as well. Okay, so what we need to consider before we put all the blame of the increasing tick abundance on deer is to think about the other hosts that are providing blood meals for ticks. And as I said, these ticks are Catholic feeding. They'll feed on anything that they can come into contact with, and frequently they'll feed on foraging birds. So as well as, and we need to be aware that as well as seeing increasing abundance of deer around the country, we're also seeing in many parts of the country increase in population, for example, of blackbirds, of song thrushes and things like that. So it may be that it's not just an increasing abundance of deer, but also a simultaneous increase in abundance of some of the other important hosts for ticks as well that's driving this increase in tick numbers. So, coming back to Lyme disease. So the old adage has always been, where you find ticks, you will find Lyme disease. And many but in the UK, there's been very, very few surveys done to actually explore this. And we did some work a few years ago now, really in northern England and to some degree in southern Scotland, where we went to a number of sites, dragged for ticks, sites where we thought we'd find ticks. We dragged for ticks and we tested the ticks for Lyme disease. And we saw some quite interesting things. We saw there were some places where we have the dark dots, where there were many ticks, the black dots, sorry, oh, this is a poor graph I've just a figure I've just realised. But the very dark dots, so like here, 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 and here, we found lots of ticks, and we also found a high prevalence of Borrelia in those ticks, maybe 6, 8, 10% of the ticks infected with the bacterium. But similarly, we found places in dark grey, unfortunately, but in Kielder, for example, in the forest of Bowland here, where there were lots of ticks, but there was almost no Lyme disease, or there was no Borrelia in those ticks. So it seems that across the UK, there are plenty of places where there are ticks, but there doesn't appear to be any or much Borrelia being carried by those tick populations. So why might that be? Well, the first thing to remember, and I said at the top that ticks will feed on anything, but Borrelia is not able to exploit every vertebrate as a reservoir host. And importantly, in this context, deer are not competent reservoirs for Borrelia burgdorferi. So deer cannot transmit the bacterium to ticks. So ticks feeding on deer will not acquire the bacterium. So this means really that if the abundance of deer, if the relative abundance of deer compared to other hosts increases, the density of infected ticks will decrease, because most of the ticks are feeding on deer which are not competent for the Borrelia burgdorferi. And there's been a number of studies, including studies by Lucy Gilbert in Scotland, showing that in areas where deer dominate the vertebrate community, there may be plenty of ticks, but there's not a lot of Borrelia in those ticks, which is kind of where which agrees with this model here. But again, we need to remember that although when we're thinking about what might be driving the presence or absence of Borrelia in tick populations, we need to think about the deer population, but then we also need to think about the relative abundance of all the other potential reservoir hosts. And that's really the challenge. So there has been some work done trying to understand why Lyme disease is where it is in ticks in the UK, but very little work. And these haven't really resulted in anything concrete yet. The most recent published work was again done in Scotland by Roman Beak in Glasgow and Lucy Gilbert again at Hutton. And they kind of surveyed around all of these sites here, looked at the prevalence of ticks and the prevalence of Borrelia in those ticks, and found really, and tried to correlate that to geolocation and habitat and stuff, and only really saw a trend that there tended to be more Borrelia further south. And that was the only, and that particular correlation wasn't particularly strong. It was significant though. So the idea that Borrelia may exist in warmer places has led to some mathematical modelling based on climate change, suggesting that if this phenomenon is real, then as the temperature of the UK increases, then we would expect the density of Borrelia-infected ticks to increase in response to that, and looking at the impact of this over time and with various predicted climate change models. So an increase of 1 degree C, mean annual temperature, will double the density of infected ticks and also lead to an extended tick season. As you know, ticks tend to come out in about March and disappear September, October, but as the country gets warmer, then that season will be extended. So likelihood is that for the UK, climate change will lead to more ticks and more infected ticks. One of the things that we've been working on is looking at these places where there is and isn't Borrelia, and saying, well, really, we've just taken a snapshot. We've been there one day in 1 year, and from that concluded that there's no Borrelia there. Is that a sensible thing to do? How stable are these foci, I suppose? And equally, how big are they? If we're thinking about intervening, trying to control that environmental hazard, can we do that on a Cumbrian scale? Or are there likely to be significant is there likely to be significant variation in environmental hazard, even between woodlands that are fairly close together? So to address both of these questions, we've been monitoring tick density and Borrelia abundance in 3 woodlands in southern Cumbria. I haven't got a scale here, but these are really only about 2 kilometres apart each one. One at the bottom of Windermere, one in Newby Bridge, and one over in Bouth near Coniston Water. And we've been going there every month, quantifying the tick density, testing the ticks for Borrelia to quantify the density of infected ticks at these sites. And the data we get is messy, and I don't expect you, sorry for this bit, well no, I'm not sorry for this busy slide, but these are the kind of sets we're trying to work with, and we see some overall trends. We see, that, for example, that the overall prevalence of Borrelia, the overall density of ticks at the 3 sites varies consistently and significantly year on year on year, and the prevalence of Borrelia in those ticks is consistent at each site and varies and doesn't vary much year on year on year. So from our sites, we've got some general trends, but we can't really, when we look at the data like this, we can't really pick anything out that's really useful from a public health perspective from trying to understand that environmental hazard. But when we oh crumbs, sorry, I forgot. That's just the tick data. That's the Borrelia prevalence data, so even messier. So just ignore those 2. But when we transform the data into the density of infected ticks that are present on the sites year on year, what we see is something quite interesting. So we see that there is significant variation in the density of infected ticks in some particular years on some particular sites. And although the sites are close together, the year of highest risk is not correlated. So there's asynchrony between even closely related sites in terms of, is it a year of high infected tick abundance? Of course, we don't understand what drives this pattern, this kind of what appears to be multi-annual cycles and asynchrony. But it kind of makes me think, for example, of the work that's done on asynchrony and multi-annual cycles in rodent populations, in lemmings and things like that. So maybe it's a reflection of multi-annual variation in the reservoir host community structure, and that's something that we're exploring now. Okay, how am I doing for time?
We've got another 10.
Okay. So that's all I'm going to say about the environmental hazard. I'm just going to talk to you a bit now about some work that we've been doing on human rate of human exposure. So as I said before, we only need to worry about environmental hazards if people are visiting the places, visiting those environments. And we should be worried about environmental human exposure because it's widely accepted now that we're going out into the countryside more, and we're seeing more and more reasons for doing that. Where we work, there's a large Forestry Commission site at Grisdale, and this for many years has been for growing timber, but more and more now it's reverting back to natural habitat and creation of recreational space. So there are far more people now coming into what we know is a ticky and limey area than ever before. So that's why now we need to be thinking, why now is timely, I suppose, to think about these human exposure rates. And very little work has been done to try and estimate how frequently people get bitten by ticks and what they do to make themselves get bitten by ticks. Are there certain people who get bitten more than others because they do certain things? And there's been 1 or 2 surveys done in Europe based on surveying Boy Scouts, for example, over a year, or surveying German soldiers over a year. But we thought we'd try and come up with a way of surveying lots of people in a very short window. And so we started to work with the organisers of some of these mad mountain marathon things where people run around Monroe's basically for a weekend. And we worked with one particular marathon in 2014, which was in Strathcarron, which again I don't need to tell you where it is, although I didn't go. So this is the Lamb Mountain Marathon. It's 2 days racing. There are a number of courses over various lengths, and people camp halfway round and then run the next bit on the Sunday. And you can see that the number of competitors is that there are plenty of mad people around to do these races. 500 racing on one or both days. And we simply explained to them what we were doing. We asked them at the end of the day to either pull the ticks off them or allow us to pull the ticks off them. And we counted the ticks and we did some screening for Borrelia. So very simple. Lovely race, nice-ish weather, very ticky. And we were kind of surprised because compared to the literature, we found far more people were getting bitten by far more ticks. So here's a summary of the data. That on day one we removed over 200 ticks from about 8.5% of the competitors, and on day two we removed almost 350 ticks from almost 14% of the competitors. So some competitors had lots of ticks on them. 28 was the record. Most had none on them. That standard distribution you'd expect. People were being bitten by larvae. There's quite a common misconception that the larval ticks can't bite you. Well, they can. But also we were finding nymph ticks, so infected ticks on people as well. And we could do some sums essentially showing the number of competitors that were being bitten by infected ticks and showing that this was not an insignificant number, I suppose. So I think really this doesn't show anything in itself, but it's given us a proof of concept, I suppose, that we can work with these people. And again, they were very, very receptive, very keen to be involved. And what we'd like to do, and maybe have a conversation with you afterwards, Jed, is again use that Strava data to think about where these competitors are going and what habitat is tends to be ticky habitat, and try and correlate a habitat with running routes, with human activities, to see if we can find what kind of habitat most people pick ticks up in and things like that. So, in summary, strong evidence that tick numbers are on the rise. We think we know a bit about why this is happening, but we're not all that sure. There certainly appears to be increasing environmental hazard, but also there may well be a case of simply more people visiting ticky areas. So the final thing I'll talk about is how one of the other reasons why Lyme disease might be increasing in the UK is that we're just more aware of it. So maybe it's nothing to do with more ticks being out there, nothing to do with there being more a Borrelia around than there was 20 years ago. It's simply that clinicians, doctors are better at recognising it. And there is plenty of work out there to suggest that Lyme disease is being underreported now. So you've seen that those about 1,500 plus 200, 1,700 cases a year are the official figures based on the lab results. But there's been work done in Inverness, which is the Scottish sort of Lyme disease reference lab, where they reckon only about 20% of the cases are referred to them. So if we do the sums, we'd expect there to be 8,000 or so cases of Lyme disease in the UK. But again, this is really dependent. If GPs are so important in diagnosing Lyme disease, then it's really important on them knowing what Lyme disease is. And there's plenty of evidence, both anecdotal and documented, that even in the same village, one GP will see lots of cases where his neighbour will have never seen it. So we did some work in our study area just to explore knowledge amongst the GPs, and we sent them this this questionnaire out a couple of years ago, or longer than that, just saying how many cases have you seen? Have you seen cases that you suspect but you're not sure about? Do people come in to have ticks taken off them? And entertainingly, can we have some of your comments, please? So we got a reasonable engagement. Lots of them had seen Lyme disease. Lots of them had seen cases that they thought were Lyme disease, but either they hadn't sent the samples off to the lab, or the lab had recorded a negative result, but that's a different subject. But we saw, like, if you go back to the HPA records, there's only been 51 cases ever reported for the whole of northwest of England, and we saw at least that number in 2 years through this small network of GPs that we consulted with, which really kind of backs up, I think, that current medical awareness of Lyme disease is still not as good as it could be. So what did they say, just to finish with? So the people in Kendal, they said that, of course, Kendal's the most important town because that's where all the ticks live. We said some GPs saying it's fine, we all know about Lyme disease, there's no problem here at all. But then his neighbour saying, we don't see Lyme disease at all in this area. I've seen one case, and this wasn't even a Cumbrian, it was a Mancunian, so we don't care. One thing we see a lot of is that local people are well versed in ticks and Lyme disease. They're seeing ticks on livestock, they're seeing ticks on their dogs. That is making them far more informed than city dwelling folk, and that's perhaps where we need to think about these tourists, these day visitors going to ticky places and educating them. And then to finish with, we just get the draconian approaches. So shoot the deer, bring back the wolf, and drain the swamps. Okay, so really just to finish off, my final point is that awareness is variable, and we need to look at ways at trying to inform the medical community more about what Lyme disease is and the risks of Lyme disease. I'm done, I think. Thank you.
Richard's usual mix of highly entertaining presentation of a very serious subject, really. So have you got any... Yes, saw the lady first.
Thank you for a very informative talk. A couple of things. I was surprised when you said that the phrase about Lyme disease has always been with us, and as a vet student in the 80s, I remember them saying there's a disease called Lyme disease in America, and that was the end of the subject. Now, I may not have been paying attention, but so I'm interested in when Lyme disease was first recorded in the UK, because if it wasn't so long ago, and I mean 50s, 30s, whatever, surely one of the reasons it's increasing, obviously there are more people on the hill, but it is just a natural progression of more and more infections spreading further and further afield. So I'm interested in that aspect. And also just in the public health aspect, I would just emphasise that I think you're absolutely right that the medics need more education. And I saw a talk by a public health expert on this, and her view was, she said, how many people in the audience think they've had this? And it was advertised as a talk on Lyme disease, and it was in the middle of the Highlands, and quite a few people put their hands up. And she said, oh yes, people often think they have. And there seemed to be no recognition that it could actually be on the increase. So,
Yeah, okay, so Borrelia burgdorferi was first described in 1980, about that time of year, when the bacterium was first associated with Lyme disease. Whether Lyme disease was around, how long Lyme disease has been around is unclear. That erythema migrans rash, that classic rash that's associated with a proportion of cases, has been described in the literature going back decades and maybe even longer than that. I think my belief is that really this country used to be all forest, I suppose, and probably supported larger populations of all of the reservoir hosts. So there's no reason why Borrelia can't have been around in the UK far more in the past than it is now. Whether that translated into cases, I'm not sure. We don't know. And we don't know really much about whether people can be infected asymptomatically, whether people who constantly come into ticks are constantly being infected but then show no symptoms, or if they develop some kind of resistance. We don't really know that. There's been some work done in the Netherlands suggesting that is the case. So I don't know how long it's been around for, but for me, I can't see it as being something that's a very modern phenomenon. Again, there's been lots of analysis of genome sequences to date the evolution and the divergence of Borrelia that shows how it's moved from Europe into North America, and then it's come back from North America and things. But we're talking millions and millions of years, not 20 or 30. And in response to your question about medical awareness, I haven't spoken about it here, but we have this issue of chronic Lyme disease now, this very controversial issue of people who have very debilitating, horrible symptoms that are being associated with Lyme disease. And I think that's clouding the true, the medical establishment view of what is and what isn't Lyme disease and the epidemiology of Lyme disease. But there are very, very few clinicians that I know, at least, who are experts in Lyme disease. There's one or two in Inverness. There's might be one in Southampton, but there's very, very little medical record of how Lyme disease is presenting in the UK. It's going to be very different from Europe because we have different flavours of Borrelia in the UK. So we just, so you're right, we don't know about it, and the issue is being clouded by this chronic Lyme disease lobby that is that's a very sensitive issue at the moment.
The back and then the front.
On the subject of doctor awareness, I am one of these, and I've treated a lot of patients over the years. Refreshingly, in the BMJ, and I have it in front of me, on the 14th of April, there was a paper, a summary of the NICE guidance, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence on Lyme disease, and it was very refreshing. But I, for years, have suggested that GPs should treat on clinical suspicion. Because once the thing's established, it can be difficult to eradicate. But a lot of GPs now have been advised not to overprescribe antibiotics. And I've heard of cases gone to GP with a classical rash and declined the treatment. But I'm just going to read a very interesting line or two. If there is a high clinical suspicion of Lyme disease, consider starting treatment while waiting for test results, and do not rule out Lyme disease even if the results are negative. So this article, I hope, will heighten awareness.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are sheep a competent host for Borrelia?
Yes. There's been work done in North Wales where in some of the landscapes there's not much but sheep, showing that sheep can maintain Borrelia. So yes, but how important that is in other settings isn't clear. Our work in Cumbria, I didn't show it, but our kind of heat maps of sheep movement don't correlate with tick abundance at all. We tried putting collars on sheep, but weren't particularly successful. But we know the sheep use the moorland almost homogeneously, and the tick distribution doesn't match where the sheep go at all. So sheep tend to have much lower tick burdens than deer, because they only really get the ticks in the places where there isn't wool. But they are thought to be competent vectors, competent hosts for Borrelia.